let's start with the situation you find yourself in at the moment.
I'm done eating now.
No, you can keep eating. So Democrats won the White House. They added seats in the House and the Senate. They actually won the popular House vote in November. So what's the role of House Republicans at this point? Do you try to pull things in your direction? Do you fight Democrats to a standstill? Or, as Bill Kristol and others have suggested, do you acknowledge now you can't run things from the House and just become the principled opposition? I guess in short, how do you balance principles and pragmatism?
It's balance. So the way I look at it, it's principled prudence. We have to exercise our principles in a prudent way with realistic expectations while being reasonable and doing what we think is right. That means our tactics will vary, but our strategy will be the same. Our strategy is to engage the Democrats on issues where we think we can improve policy, to oppose them on issues where we simply have fundamental disagreements. And the way we see it, our value add to the political system at the moment, of all things, is to help prevent a debt crisis. It's frustrating to see how little desire our colleagues on the other side or the president have with getting spending under control or reforming entitlements. That, to us, is the most important thing because we fear a debt crisis and what that would do to the people in this nation, to our economy, and to the next generation. And so we have to set our expectations accordingly. We have to explain who we are, what we believe in, and fight for those things in a realistic way, make policy better where we can through engagement, and where we simply agree to disagree, I think more than ever before, and I've always believed this, but more than ever before, we need to offer principled alternatives to explain to the country how we would do things differently. I think it's going to be different in a positive way from our perspective, and that's this. The President and the Senate more or less sold their agenda with rhetoric and passed their agenda but didn't implement their agenda. Now the rubber's hitting the road. Now Obamacare is being implemented. Now the agenda is actually being executed. And where we can make things better, we will. But where we can point how we would do things differently, we'll have a better chance of showing a contrast in visions because it will be the actual agenda as it's being implemented. And we, I think, owe the country specific reforms on how we would do things differently. So how would we do things differently in health care? How would we reform Medicare? What is our economic growth policy? What is our energy policy? All of those things. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to give specific alternative so that people can see once this vision is being implemented how we would do things differently to prepare ourselves, hopefully, for one day of actually implementing these things. And in the meantime, buy the country time by helping prevent a debt crisis in any way we can. I don't think they're going to want to reform entitlements like we want to or we should. And there are people who agree with us on how to reform these entitlements from the other side of the aisle. But I don't see any great desire to do fundamental entitlement reform. That means we'll have to do things that buy us time. That means we'll have to do things that take a dent out of debt to buy the country time. That's kind of how I see it, our approach.
Where are the areas where you think you can work with them to, quote, improve their policy?
Immigration's a good one. I really do believe, based on the conversations I have with good friends of mine on the other side of the aisle, who've been friends of mine for a long time on these issues, where Republicans are. I personally actually have a bit of a history on this issue. People don't know that because I've been mostly a budget guy. I did all of Jack Kemp's anti-Prop 187 work. I did a Sam Brownback's work to maintain family immigration. I co-sponsored Colby Flake Gutierrez, which was the McCain-Kennedy thing in the Senate in '05, I think, when we did that. So I've long believed in immigration reform, and I think there are other Republicans who do so as well. That's an area where Democrats have to ask themselves, do we want law and fix the problem, or are we just looking for a political issue? And I think there are a lot of good legislators on the other side of the aisle who really, really want to fix this problem. And so I'm encouraged about that one. on the other stuff, everybody, I suppose, will spend most of this time talking about fiscal issues. What we're doing today, the bill we're passing today, we think will give us the ability to have a debate that will last a number of months about contrasting visions and about how to fix this problem. And we see this is a very defining moment for this session of Congress and our caucus in getting a down payment on a debt crisis, on averting it. And so that to us is probably the biggest issue. And there will be a lot of conflict surrounding this. But at the end of the process, our job, as we see it, is to get spending under control, to get some entitlement reforms, to make sure we don't have a debt crisis popping in the near future.
One of the things that Speaker Boehner has said in the last couple of days, and said it very clearly yesterday, is that there will be a Republican budget that comes to balance in 10 years. That would be your job, I assume. You did a budget.
I'm familiar with that, yeah.
Yeah. The last budget you presented didn't get to balance until 2040. So you got your work cut out for you. How are you going to get
in the
from here to
2030s,
there?
but who's counting?
Right.
So we do have our work cut out for us. There are other things. The baseline will change. We won't get our baseline from CBO until I think February 4th. They're late because of the cliff. But that's a baseline we will work off of. I'm assuming that the president's going to be more than a week late on the budget.
Safe.
And so we can't wait for the rescore. You know how this works. You wait for the rescore of his budget to do the baseline. We'll probably go with the February 4 baseline, which is almost the same as what the president's rescore baseline is. But the baseline will be different. And we're going to have a conversation on the Budget Committee and in our caucus about other things that will get us there. And that's what we intend to do.
So you think
I mean, I've been running budgets for a long time. I do believe we can hit those targets. It's going to involve some differences from past budgets that we've offered.
in what category?
Well, I have to do this with my committee members. No offense, but I'm not going to get ahead of my caucus and the members of our committee about what things we have to do to get there because we haven't had that conversation yet.
All right, can you get to balance in 10 years and not raise revenues?
Yes. Yeah, the revenue baseline is obviously higher now that we have this cliff behind us.
And what do you hope
You
that...
have higher revenues now in the baseline than you did before.
Right, but not high enough to get to balance without some pretty deep spending cuts.
Well, but I think we've always needed spending cuts. I mean, that's not hard for us to acknowledge.
Then what do you hope to do with that budget? In other words, how does that budget translate into the goal, the higher goal that you just articulated, which is to present ideas to help prevent a debt crisis?
So, one of the reasons why we took Jim Cooper's bill and added it to the temporary debt limit extension is because we think we should not just be talking about crisis to crisis, default or shutdown. We should be talking about what's your plan to budget? What's your plan to get to balance? What's your plan to avoid a debt crisis? What's your plan to save Medicare? What's your plan to save Social Security? What's your plan to grow the economy and reform the tax code? That's the kind of debate we want to get into, and that's why we're saying the Senate should at least, look, the 74 Budget Act says you have to pass a budget by April 15th. There's a deadline in it. It's been ignored for 4 years. And therefore, the nation has been deprived of the kind of debate that they deserve about a vision of how to fix your fiscal problems. That's the debate we want. We will we'll put our budget out there. The Senate should do the same so that the country can have the kind of debate so that they can understand the trade-offs.
So you don't expect to have a joint resolution. You expect two competing plans.
I expect two competing plans, but I do expect at the end of these things, the sequester, the CR, the budget debate, and then you have a ceiling in May or whenever, I assume May, I expect to come out of that is a big down payment on the debt crisis.
And then what do you think happens when the extension of the debt ceiling is reached? I mean, you're going to do that today. There's going to be an extension. Everybody seems to agree that's the path that's going to be pursued on that subject. But there is an end to the extension of the debt ceiling.
Right.
What's your vision for the action that occurs when the debt ceiling extension
My vision
is
is in the intervening days and months is that we will have this debate about how to fix this problem, and hopefully people can come together to agree on getting a down payment on the debt crisis, getting a down payment on spending cuts. Spending cuts are coming. I mean, that's automatically happening in law. And we are not going to lose the $1.2 trillion we've already got for the last debt ceiling. We are going to have to negotiate on top of that for a new debt ceiling increase. And that's the kind of debate we're going to have, and we're going to have to come out of that with a plan. I mean, we are very serious about this. We're going to have to come out of that a plan to get spending under control.
The president said in his inaugural, as you know, that the commitments we make to each other through Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security don't sap our initiative. They strengthen us. They don't make us a nation of takers. They free us to take risks that make this country great. What's your reaction to that?
It's familiar. This is why I feel optimistic about the debate that's coming and about where we stand on it. Because the president continues to shadowbox straw men. Who is against Social Security and Medicare? I mean, look what it did to me in my own life, for me, for my family. Those programs were very important to my family when we needed it. And so when I see the president, for the umpteenth time, erect a straw man argument to defeat that straw man and win the debate by default, it tells me that he's not yet ready to have an honest debate with people who disagree with him on the facts. That tells me we have a better argument. So we're used to the straw man argument. We're used to the president affixing views to his political adversaries that they don't have to try and win this debate by default. And that tells me we have a much better hand going into this from an argumentative standpoint.
Oh.
And so when I hear that, I mean, look, these are earned entitlements. People pay their taxes for their working lives to receive these benefits that they earned, that they paid for. So to suggest that people think that that's, you know, a deadbeat thing or something like that, that's just not true. What we're worried about is a culture of dependency that drains and saps people of making the most of their lives. We're not talking about Medicare, Social Security entitlements. We're talking about, do we have an economic policy of social mobility, of upward mobility? Are we attacking poverty at the root causes, or are we simply merely treating the symptoms of poverty to make it easier to tolerate and therefore perpetuate it? Those are the things that we need to get into in the debate, and that's what I'm excited about. So when I was talking to Jerry about, you know, other alternatives, we've got to show, here's our plan for education reform in the inner city. Here's our plan to fight poverty. Here's our plan on how to get upward mobility turned back on in this country, which has been slowing down. Those are the things that I think we need to complete our vision with and show how we would do these things differently.
Well, let me make sure I understand. So why is it a straw man? I thought that your view was we should spend less on Medicare than the president proposes, less than the current projection.
The straw man, and I'm also referencing his press conference that was, a week or two ago,
right,
where he says we have suspicions about feeding the poor and the elderly and programs like Social Security and Medicare. We don't have suspicions about such things. That's crazy. We're the ones who are actually proposing the solutions to save these programs, to save them from bankruptcy, to prevent interruptions from people who are in retirement, so that we can save them by reforming it for my generation, so that they're there for my generation when we retire. To suggest people like us have suspicions about these things is affixing motives to political adversaries that they don't have. And so when you try to question a person's motives in a debate, it's a weak argument that tells me you're not really interested in debating the facts of the debate. That's what I mean when I say that.
Okay, but I'm not asking you about the motives. If you're not going to get savings from Medicare and you're not going to get savings from Social
No, I think we have to get savings from these programs in order to save these programs. But by reforming these programs, that does not mean that you are against these programs. That does not mean that you think less of these programs or think less of the people who are on these programs, like my mom. This means, by reforming these programs, this means we want to make sure that they're working. This means that my mom will continue to receive these benefits, that my generation will get these benefits, that my kids will get these benefits when they retire. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Let me ask one final question, and then we'll open it up to everybody around the table. I've been curious about something for a couple of weeks now. There was a fiscal cliff deal at the end of the year, raised rates on the top earners, obviously. In the end, You and Speaker Boehner voted for that. Your Young Gun colleagues, Eric Cantor and Kevin McCarthy, voted against it. Why did you vote yes, and why do you think they voted no?
Well, I can't speak for those two guys. I'll let them, and when you're exercising prudential judgment, you have to understand that people who are allies and colleagues of yours might have a different opinion, and you need to respect that opinion. The way I looked at that bill was we believed it needed to pass. I believed it needed to pass. And if you believe a piece of legislation needs to pass, then you should vote for it and not worry about the criticism that comes with it. John Boehner offered $800 billion to start with in these negotiations, and we ended up with about $650. I didn't think we were going to get a better deal than that. Point number one. Point number two, 98% of Americans missed a tax increase. Point number three, this was made permanent. We got permanent on AMT, permanent on the rates, permanent on a superior estate tax policy. Granted, not exactly the policy I wanted, but much better policy. And so to me, the prudential thing to do was, if you think this is a step in the right direction, which it clearly was. We couldn't even get this stuff when we had the House, the Senate, and George W. Bush in office. Take it. Yeah. And so, yes, I got criticized, and that happens, but after a while, when you've done this job for a while, you just can't worry about the criticism that comes. If you think the bill needs to pass, if you're asking members of your caucus to vote for it so that it passes, then you have an obligation to vote for it, is the way I see it.
Questions?
Thank you.
Ask a long question so I can get some food.
Try to speak very slowly, Congressman. Taking off your last point, Congressman Ryan, about now that with the fiscal cliff deal, we've got permanency on many of the rates, AMT, which we couldn't get under George W. Bush as well, the president. Has this now given up the impetus for tax reform, which many of us feel is very necessary for economic growth?
I was going to make that my fifth point. I don't want to just, you can eat all the bullets in your article, just take all your column space away. My fifth point was, this gets a little arcane, but this helps us with our baseline tremendously. Look, I'm on Ways and Means as well. Dave Camp and I, we're planning on doing a tax reform bill this year. We're going to show, our goal is to show, here's what we think we should do with tax expenditures. And look, we don't think we should do all this crony capitalism through the tax code. But to get a good tax reform plan, broader base, lower rates, you need a baseline to work with. This gets us a good baseline to work with. The baseline before the fiscal cliff was harder to write tax reform than the baseline after the fiscal cliff. And so this makes it much easier to actually do tax reform. That's why I thought, let's get the baseline.
Ezra?
Thanks. These conversations tend to focus pretty heavily on Medicare and Social Security in particular. In your budget, though, a very, very large chunk of the long-term cuts come out of the everything else. I believe that category of spending...
Probably Medicaid, then other mandatory.
Yeah, Medicaid as well, but Medicaid, Social Security, and Medicare, if I remember, actually get a smaller percentage of GDP cuts by 2050 than all other things combined, which go from, if I'm not wrong, around 12% now to under 3.75% in 2050.
I haven't looked at it in a little while. I was busy since the last budget.
How does that path work? We've always had defense spending above 3% or 4% of GDP. That was obviously a base floor under Romney. How would it work to bring all other categories, including defense, down to that sort of low of a percentage of the budget?
Yeah, to start with, I've never been a fan of putting a floor on anything. So, my friends at Heritage, want the 4% floor. I don't like the idea of just putting arbitrary floors under anything. So, I've never personally agreed with that approach. As you know, if you're holding discretionary at some rate of growth, slower than the economy, its take as a percentage of the economy shrinks over time. The baseline just does that. So you know how mandatory squeezing discretionary, and over time, discretionary shrinks as a share of the economy. So I don't really think, especially looking in the out years, that spending on a program as a share of GDP is really a good reflection of what these programs look like, because the economy will outgrow certain programs that you're constraining the growth on. And that doesn't necessarily reflect how good the policy is or how much you're dedicating to it. So I always warn people about out-year assessments on, say, discretionary or other mandatory, or whatever category as a percentage of GDP in the out years. number one. Number two, Medicaid, we believe in federalism. We believe in block granting. And obviously, we believe in repealing Obamacare. So if you repeal Obamacare, which, you have about a 33% in the eligibility, and you block grant, the governors we consulted said, give us population plus inflation. That gets us a lot of savings in the 10-year window. And the other mandatory category, which is a lot of programs, there are a lot of reforms that we think are desperately needed. SNAP is one of those programs we think is in desperate need of reforms. We see a lot of those programs in sort of we call it welfare reform part 2, which was to embrace the federalism notion and embrace what were the successful tools that helped get welfare reform off and running in such a successful way. Ron Haskins has done a lot of work over at Brookings on this, which is time limits, work requirements, those kinds of things. So we think those are good quality reforms that help get people on the path of upward mobility and social mobility. At the same time, it does produce savings in the 10-year window. It slows the growth rate, and as the growth rate slows and the economy grows, the delta, increases.
Jackie?
First, to clarify, I assume the bill that you and Congressman Camp will do on tax reform will be revenue neutral?
Yes.
And you say the thing you expect, your goal is to get a big down payment on the debt. How do you expect to do that with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president without having some revenues?
He already got his revenues.
But as you noted too, it wasn't even as much as
That's what
John
bipartisan
Boehner.
compromises do. This bipartisan compromise, which was, I guess you could call this McConnell-Biden, I don't know who you want to be the author of this, was a bipartisan compromise. Mm-hmm. And the president got his revenues. We have yet to see any spending cuts from these revenues that have occurred. So, don't forget, there's $1 trillion in revenues that come with Obamacare tax increases. You've got this on top of it now, what, 650, just round it to 650. So they've already got the revenues. And if we believe in pro-growth tax reform, which is lower rates so we're more competitive with a broader base, so we're not doing social engineering through the tax code as much, and that's pro-growth, which we believe, then you have to basically stick with where you are. Otherwise, you won't have a good tax code.
So I understand where you're coming from, but as a practical matter, how do you actually achieve and get signed into law a big down payment on the debt by maintaining that position?
We're going to have this
revenues?
debate over the January, February, March, April, and whenever this thing resolves time period on how to do that.
One other thing I wanted to clarify on what you said. You mentioned the $1.2 trillion in spending cuts, and that you have to build on that in order
right.
to get another debt limit increase.
Yeah, that was for the last debt limit increase. Right.
Right, so that's the sequestration amount
Right,
you're referring
right.
to, right?
Right.
So even when you get enough savings to diffuse sequestration, you're calling for another
Of course.
$1 trillion.
That's the whole Boehner
That
protocol.
wasn't clear in the fiscal cliff period exactly.
Well, the fiscal cliff period wasn't.
Well, when they were still trying.
It wasn't clear. No, so the Boehner rule, I guess we call it this now, is $1 of cuts or reforms for $1 of debt limit increases. And so we think the best way to prevent a debt crisis is to get some mandatory reforms that really bend the curve on debt. Those combined with spending cuts, real actual 10-year window spending cuts, are what you'll need to do to get the extra debt limit increase on top of the one that was already passed in the past.
You know the numbers well enough to know that that's mathematically unsustainable for very long, the dollar for a debt limit
Well,
increase.
but our goal is if we're not going to pass a plan to get the budget on a good path in one plan, like, if we won, Mitt and I planned on doing this year, saving Medicare, saving Medicaid, saving Social Security, doing tax reform, preventing a debt crisis, economic growth policies, immigration reform, the whole gamut. That ain't going to happen because we didn't win. We understand that. We get that. So we want to try in installments, get a down payment year by year on preventing a debt crisis, on balancing the budget, and getting this debt under control. The reason we feel compelled to do this is because if we don't, we will have a serious problem in this country. I mean, look, if interest rates go on us, and that's a whole other conversation, we lose control of our fiscal situation. And we owe it to ourselves, to our constituents, to our countrymen, to our children, not to let that happen. And so that's how serious we see this moment. And so we don't put ourselves in the box of the political, what can you do because, of current considerations. We put ourselves in the box of what must we do to save the country from a crisis, which we know is coming. It's not an if, it's a when.
Michael, Lori, and then Tom.
Congressman, I'm still missing something. What leverage, I don't see what leverage you have to compel these cuts. Could you explain that one more time?
Well, we have a sequester kicking in on March the 1st. We have a continuing resolution expiring on March the 27th. We have budgets that, if the Senate decides to do its job this year, will come out in April. So we can have a debate about how to fix the problem, not if to fix the problem. And then you'll have a debt limit after all of that. These are the points we think force the kind of conversation that we're just going to have. Look, it's become very clear to us that the president is not interested in cutting spending or reforming entitlements. The problem is, if you don't do that, you'll have a debt crisis.
So after what you've just been through, you still believe that threatening to shut down the government is a viable strategy?
I don't see how...
For a strategy for a party that's at about, what, 20, 15, 18%?
So we don't have much to lose, do we? You have to understand, this is not about politics and what makes us popular. This is about what do we think is the right thing to do. And by the way, there are a lot of Democrats who agree with us. They won't say so publicly, but there are a lot of Democrats who believe we need to reform entitlements. We need to get deficit spending under control. Because if we don't, we will have a debt crisis. This isn't just like a Republican. It's not a Republican against Democrat thing. It's a math thing. And the math is really, really clear. And so if there's any value to having divided government, this ought to be what we get out of it. Lori.
So about the math thing, your budget last year made extraordinarily deep cuts by Democratic standards across a spectrum of programs that the president has vowed to defend. So 2 questions. One, if you're going to get to balance in a decade rather than 3 decades, can you do that without fairly quickly taking savings out of Social Security and Medicare, which you protected in past budgets?
Yeah. So 2 different programs there, by the way. None of the things we've proposed affect current retirees. And we've always believed that. We've always believed the best way going forward is to prospectively phase in reforms so that people who've organized their lives around these promises get the promises kept made to them. I do believe that you can do that. The other question, deep cuts, we still grow spending in our budget. Spending still increases in our budget year after year, just doesn't increase as fast as, say, the president's budget. So spending still goes up, and it will still go up under our budget that we're going to propose. The question is how much of a spending increase can we absorb and afford? Plus, don't forget growth. You can never forget you need growth. Now, as Jackie mentioned, baselines and static, we'll have to do this on a static basis. But if we put in place, our goal is not just to show something that looks clean on a spreadsheet. Our goal is to advance policies that make a difference in people's lives. And that means we want to advance pro-growth reforms that are good for the economy. There's some immigration things that I think are good for the economy. Maybe we can get some energy policy that's good for the economy. Maybe there are some ideas we can put in place that get growth. Because if we can get growth, then we can really help improve our fiscal situation quite a bit. So, yeah, we're going to have to show cuts. We've always been willing to show cuts. But even with the kinds of cuts we're going to have to show to get to balance, spending will still increase.
Well, I was heading towards a political question, though. If you want to do tax reform, presumably you're going to want a reconciliation bill, which requires you to get some kind of budget agreement with the Senate.
That's right.
And they have said, Schumer said over the weekend, saying that he's got the agreement of Reid and Murray on this, that they want to do reconciliation to get revenues. Are you absolutely ruling out the possibility?
No, we want to do
of
reconciliation to get tax reform, revenue-neutral tax reform.
Yeah, you have a Democratic Senate that you got to work.
They've already gotten revenues. Yeah, so what, we roll over and they get their, that's just not how it works.
In the spirit of bipartisan compromise, is there some...
That's right. So in the spirit of bipartisan compromise, they got the revenue increases already. We have yet to get anything as a result of it. It used to be 3-to-1, right? Isn't that what Erskine says? 3-to-1, $3 of spending cuts for every dollar of tax increase. I think the president in his own budget last year claimed, what, 2.5-to-1? I think that's what their claim was. I mean, we would argue with whether they achieved that or not. So where's the 3? Where's the 2.5?
You already got 2.
They got 600. Where's the 1.8 trillion in
But you
cuts?
got 2.2, 2.4 between the BCA and the
That was
sequester?
last session. We're going forward now.
Tom, Gwen, and then Corey.
Congressman, if I may ask, how did the experience of being the Republican vice presidential nominee impact on your priorities, if at all, your legislative priorities, if at all, in Congress, and how has it impacted, if at all, you being a congressman, as a congressman?
That's interesting. It's given me a better appreciation for the moment the country's in, I think. What was great about the experience was I just got to travel the country and meet a lot of really incredible people. I mean, that was really encouraging. I look back at the experience as having benefited from it tremendously. My family did very well and is doing great. And it gave me an appreciation for the moment we're in. It's a very historical moment. And the moment I see is a very pivotal moment for our nation. And it's surrounding these economic and fiscal issues. And so as a member of Congress, it's a experience that has made me a lot less risk averse from a political perspective and more focused on just doing what you think the right thing is.
Any thought about it? I'm sorry.
No.
Okay, good. Save me from having to
Just
ask.
finished one of those. No, I'm.
Gwen.
Actually, I want to pick up a little bit on Tom's point, which is that, and this is kind of more experiential. We watched you on the podium on Monday, sitting next to Jay-Z or near him somewhere.
Yeah, he was a nice guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're sitting in a completely different chair than you thought you might be in that day.
That's true. About 8 rows behind me.
So, I'm sitting there looking at you and thinking, what's going through your mind? What are you watching? Are you sitting there thinking, there go all my plans, there go all our ideals? You listen to the president give what is generally considered to be an uncompromising.
Yeah. I mean, that was the speech I kind of expected him to give because that's the kind of speech he usually gives.
Is it really? In an inaugural?
Well, it's not typical for an inaugural, but I think it was fairly typical for the president.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So, when I went there, I thought, you know what? I'm in Congress, so I need to go. But more to the point, I need to go to.
Considered not going?
No, no. So, but my point was, when I was thinking was, it's important to demonstrate that in this country, we have a peaceful transition or reaffirmation of power. And I felt like my presence there was helping demonstrate the symbolism of that moment. And I thought that was really important because we have a great country and we need to learn how to agree to disagree in a civil way. So civility was what was running through my mind at the time. The other thing was, I won't say his name, there was a member of Congress sitting near me who didn't know who Beyonce or Jay-Z was. And so I had a great time explaining.
A lot of people in this room may not have known.
Yeah, I did, that's amazing to me, actually. But so I explained to this gentleman who Beyonce, probably the most popular pop star in the world, is. I guess you could debate that, but she's right up there in Jay-Z. He was a nice guy. He came up and shook my hand and was very friendly, and she was.
Did you have any despair looking at this?
No, I don't despair. I think despair is wrong. I gave up despair for Lent last time. So, clearly I thought about the woulda, coulda, shoulda, but I already got that. I already processed that thinking after the election, during the holidays, during the Thanksgiving and Christmas time, New Year's time. The thing is, I had to jump right back into work. So you basically have to dust yourself off and get back to work. I mean, John called me Wednesday morning and asked me to come back as budget chair and to pick up where I left off, and I automatically did. I didn't really think I would. It never occurred to me that I'd do anything else. So no, what I regret And what I thought about was, this isn't one of those elections where we were going to go this way or that way, a subtle shift to the left or a subtle shift to the right. That's not this kind of, this is an election where we go this way versus that way. So knowing what we were planning on doing from working with Mike Levitt on the readiness project, knowing what we were going to do with the charm offensive we were going to launch with Senate Democrats and the entitlement reforms we were going to embrace and the tax reform we were going to embrace and all the energy things that we thought would be helpful for growing the economy, and now knowing that that's not going to happen, that is disconcerting. That's regretful.
You can't still launch that charm offensive?
But sure. I mean, those friends are still there. The problem is we're not in the position of the White House, of control. We're in the minority party. We're not in the majority party. So it's you know, I note the difference in the direction of the country as a result of this election. I regret that. But I think what you do in these situations is you pick yourself off. I look at the glass of life as being half full. I'm just that kind of a person. And I'm generally an eternally optimistic person because in America we fix our problems. We might not necessarily fix them in the timeline that I was hoping we would, but I think we'll fix them. I feel pretty good about our chances of avoiding a debt crisis, of turning this economy around, of making sure that our kids grow up with a better future, and of reigniting upward mobility, social mobility. And I think we'll get there. It just won't be as clean and quick and easy as I thought we would. That's all.
So basically the Jay-Z moment allowed you to relive that iPod debate from the
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to go Susan, Doyle, Corey, and then Bell.
So another non-math question, which is, when was the last time you spoke with Mitt Romney? Do you think that he has a role in the kind of national debate going forward? And do you think he sees a role for himself?
We talked, we were going to have lunch in a couple of days, and we email. When I've actually talked to him, it's been a few weeks when we actually have spoken, but we email quite a bit with each other. I think Mitt thought the gracious right thing to do was not to be out in front in the intermeeting time. The reason I've done Wisconsin media, but the reason I haven't done media until I wanted to stay out of it from the election to the inauguration because I thought that was just sort of the polite thing to do. And I wanted to make sure that if I injected myself in the fiscal cliff talks, I didn't want to politicize it. So I stayed out of that, out of doing media for the most part to try and make it easier and more conducive to get an agreement. And so I think Mitt had the same thinking, which was we should not be out injecting ourselves in the political discussion between the election and the inauguration. I think that's just kind of the gracious thing to do. Obviously, the inauguration's over, so we're here talking. Mitt has whatever role he wants to have. There are people who are grateful for the race he ran, for the standard he bared, and I think it's going to be whatever he wants to do. And I think he's thinking about what that will be. He's obviously not planning on doing any other races, and so it puts him in a unique position to be a leader in our party, to weigh in on big issues on where our party ought to go and the direction we ought to take. And I think he's just going to have to, he's going to think about what role that wants to be. And I don't know that he's settled on exactly how he wants to play that role yet.
Do you happen to know what he did on Monday or whether he watched the
I don't know.
inauguration?
I don't know.
Doyle?
And now that you've had 2.5 months to absorb it, what's your conclusion on what the voters were saying to the Republican Party?
Well, the big regret I have is we lost. It's a bit closer than people think. The RNC tells me it's between 4 and 5. The canvassing isn't all finished, but they tell me it's between 400,000 and 500,000 votes spread across 4 states that have basically made the difference. You know, New Hampshire, Virginia, Ohio, and Florida. So I think it's closer than you think. The big debate that revolves is, you know, they really did a phenomenal job on technology and turnout, and they should get credit for that. That was really, you know, unprecedented how well they did on that. We have to learn that too. We have to fix that. The other thing I think is we have to do a better job of explaining in demonstrating why we think our ideas are better for everybody, why our ideas are better for fighting poverty, why we think our ideas are better for getting people on the ladder of life and upward mobility. There are a lot of people who just don't think or know that we have good ideas on these fronts. You know that Saturday Night Live skit that says, more cowbell? I forgot. Remember that? I always used to say more Jack Kemp. More Jack Kemp. Jack was my mentor, and I believe, we need to do a better job of explaining how our ideas are better for everybody in this country.
So technique and communication, but you don't think there was any message there from the public about what the
No, I don't think
message was?
I don't see this as a rejection of our principles. I think we need to do a better job of applying our principles to the problems of the day to show solutions to the country's biggest problems and how they relate in people's everyday lives. We believe in, school choice, in school competition. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that we have better answers for education reform for kids trapped in failing schools in the inner city. We need to do a better job of showcasing this and talking about this. That's the speech I tried to give at the Kemp Foundation dinner, which was the only sort of public thing I did in the intervening time, was that point. That speech basically encapsulates my thinking.
Corey and then Bell.
Thank you. Congressman, there's been increasing chatter amongst Republicans that the sequester, whilst a blunt tool, does give you $1.2 trillion in cuts, and that perhaps it should be allowed to take effect. And another idea I've heard in recent days is giving either the OMB or individual departments more flexibility as to how it's implemented. What do you think about the sequester, given that it is current law, and what do you think about this idea of greater flexibility?
I don't know. I haven't given enough thought to the greater flexibility point. But it will take effect if we don't have better cuts that replace those. So I'm expecting the sequester to take effect. We can't give up the spending cuts that are already about to take place to pay for the last debt ceiling increase. And so I believe we're going to have a big debate in this country about how to actually cut spending in an intelligent way and reform entitlements so that we can get a down payment on debt reduction and get us on a path to balance. So yeah, the sequester is happening. We expect that because we have yet to see Senate Democrats offer an alternative. We have yet to see the president offer an alternative that replaces those cuts. I passed a bill twice that shows how we would replace those cuts with others. There have been no counteroffers on that front.
Bill.
I'm really glad to hear you talking about social mobility. I have a budget question, but just wanted to say that first since I have great interest in that topic. I want to go back to
As do I.
This issue of entitlements. And as you have said, there are a lot of people who think that entitlements have to be part of the solution here, an important part of the solution, and that the big problem is long-term, not just the next 10 years. And it seems to me, if I were in your shoes, or in the shoes of anyone who thinks that's the case, and I had more or less ruled out any cuts that affect people over the next 10 years, people who are 55 and over, I wouldn't want to put so much emphasis on balancing the budget in the next 10 years. I would want to put a lot more emphasis on getting us on a better glide path to the future. I would also recognize that probably you're going to need some revenues as part of this mix. And maybe it's a bargaining position to say we have to have revenue neutrality, but you're not going to achieve your goals if there isn't some compromise there. And I think also, as a tactic or strategy here, to constantly be emphasizing that there are going to be so many cuts to programs like Medicaid and SNAP and other areas that are very dear to the hearts of Democrats doesn't help to move this ball forward. And so it's just really very confusing to some of us who like some of what you proposed to see this strategy that doesn't seem to me to get us where we need to be going. And on the sequester, it seems to me there's an easy, not easy, but at least an easier road there. Because Democrats don't like the domestic spending cuts and Republicans don't like defense, and so nobody likes the sequester. And so there should be some ability to come together to replace that on both the domestic and the defense side. And if you do that and you don't do a whole lot else, maybe you do a chain CPI, maybe you do some more health care savings, you could begin to really stabilize and perhaps even reduce the growth of debt to GDP.
That's our aim.
Well,
Stabilize
but
and reduce the growth of
I'm
debt to
having a hard
GDP.
time.
Have things with big out-year savings.
Having a hard time reconciling that with some of the other positions here.
Well, so if I should take your question as a word of advice, I shouldn't be negotiating through the media. What we're going to do.
That's not what she meant at all.
We paid for this coffee, Congressman Ryan.
So, I've enjoyed your work on upward mobility. I've read it. You've been really thought-provoking on that. So let me just snap, just for an example. All our reforms say is you actually have to qualify for the benefit to receive it. If you would put our reforms in place over the last decade, they would have grown to 260% instead of 270%. We're not slashing these programs. We're bringing some common sense reforms of these programs, which, if we settle down the rhetoric, would be sort of common sense things to make them more sustainable. So what we think we're doing is bringing sustainability to these programs so that they can survive. That's the point. And I take your point on windows and budget cuts, but I think we have an obligation to show the country that we can actually get to a balanced budget, you know, in a reasonable time period. And do we believe that we will pass that in law? Well, I don't think the Senate's interested. We'll see what the Senate offers. But maybe we can put components of that budget into law that get us those savings. And if you look at the Boehner rule, it's cuts or reforms. And we want to get these big reforms that make a difference to get debt under control and stabilize debt. That is what we think our value add to this divided government is. And going into this with the leverage such as we have it, and you can all assess what we do or do not have, at the outside of this, the outcome of this is we better get our debt under control. And that's what we're going to fight for. I'll just leave it at that.
Ezra, Max, and then Sue.
So to follow up then a bit on what Isabel was asking, I think also what Lori was asking, it seems pretty clear that if House Republicans were open to a deal that had significant spending cuts and, say, another $700 billion in revenue increases generated through tax reform.
In addition to what's already occurred?
In addition to what's already occurred.
700?
700 billion, 1.3 trillion in total without the Affordable Care Act. You could get a deal that would easily stabilize debt to GDP over the next decade and, in fact, bring it clearly on a downward path. Now, I think if I ask you why you wouldn't take that deal, you'd say that that level of taxation would hurt growth. And so my question is, what is the evidence, be it historical or academic, that undergirds the idea that bringing another 600 or 700 billion out of tax expenditures, which people like Alan Greenspan think are properly understood as spending, what is the evidence that makes you convinced that would have such a deleterious effect on the economy that it wouldn't be worth taking it in order to get the debt deal?
I think rates matter. I think the statutory rate matters at the end of the day.
But you could still have the same or lower rate there.
I don't know about that. You have to, remember, we have to write these things statically. We don't use macroeconomic feedback scoring at joint tax.
But if you kept deductions at 15,000, you wouldn't change rates.
Well, you have to decide. You have to decide where you want to cap deductions. You have to decide what deductions stay or go, what you can pass, and what the resulting rates will be. The other problem that I've noticed, this is just experience. This is my 15th year in Congress. Every time you give a little revenue, it just goes to spending. You don't get this. You don't actually end up getting this. The spending cuts are always later. They're always like, oh, pocket the revenue, and let's talk spending later. You know, it's one of those fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. The revenues they've already gotten revenues. We still, have not done what we need to do to get this debt and deficit under control. And you mathematically cannot fix this problem through revenues. You have to fix it through real entitlement reforms and, yes, actual spending cuts.
But just on-
and that stuff, you know, Ezra, when you hear the rhetoric, when you see the lack of effort to even tackle these things from the other side, why should we think that they're actually going to put this up when all they want to do is pocket more revenues and not actually cut spending and reform entitlements?
But assuming that you guys have
And by the way, I think that
ability
is
to
way
write a
too
deal-
high. From a
hear you.
baseline standpoint, I just don't see how you get there.
Right, I hear you, but assuming you could write a deal that had both spending cuts and revenues, which I believe you could do, what is the study or what makes you concerned about it? Assume you could write the deal where the spending cuts were real, and I believe you could.
No,
What
I've
makes
always thought you could
concerned
get higher revenues through tax reform, and with the baseline we have right now, you can get it. There isn't a axiomatic sweet spot here, but we do believe growth occurs on the margin, rates matter, and especially in the 21st century where we have more tax competition, where we have the highest corporate rate in the industrialized world, where other countries don't really have a pass-through income system like we do, where most of our businesses are pass-throughs, and therefore their rates are really high compared to their competitors' rates. Canada lowered their rates to 15% on all their businesses. Where I come from, we compete against Canadians, and our top rate is going north of 40% now. It's pretty tough to tell a Wisconsin manufacturer, you know, a guy in the industrial park who's got 180 employees, who's a job shop, you know, tool and die, with CNC machines, who's competing against a Canadian. Good luck, you know, when you're being taxed over 40% and they're at 15%. These rates, which is new in this century, matter even more in global competition.
We're going to go here, and Sue, and then Joe.
Chairman, are you suggesting that, going back to the math question, you said that the reforms to Medicare wouldn't apply to people who are, say, 55 or older, but as some members have suggested, wouldn't it be necessary in order to balance the budget in 10 years to make those reforms applicable to people who are, say, 6, 7, or 8 years away from becoming eligible for the program?
You know, I'm just not going to get ahead of ourselves. I haven't even sat down with my committee members on the budget committee. I don't even have a baseline yet with which to write the budget. So it would just be premature to speculate or comment on where we're going to go before I've even gotten the baseline, meaning measuring stick, and met with my members to come up with it.
But mathematically, wouldn't that be a logical inference?
I'm just not going to get into it. It'd be premature.
Sue?
I want to completely switch gears on you for a minute. I'm curious about what your take is on the gun debate that we're having right now. I know you are a hunter, I know you have young children, and I know that there's not much appetite among Republicans in the House to have this debate. I'm curious if you think that what appears to be sort of a national need to have this debate outweighs perhaps some of the resistance in the party to allow things like votes on potentially assault weapons bans or magazine clips or new databases or things along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, those of us who are parents, I think the biggest fear we have in our lives is the safety of our kids. And hopefully this debate will maintain a level of civility that doesn't question, you know, the motives of people who disagree on various reform proposals, that as if we don't, you know, love our kids as much. The point I'm making is, let's have a civil debate, and let's have a debate based upon what we think is good policy and effective policy. You know, the last, we've had an assault weapons ban before, and we still had a lot of mass shootings. You have 10 million guns in America. I think we should question the efficacy of policies. You know, recycled policies of the past that have not proven to be successful, you know, may take our eyes off of the ball of actually working on policies that might actually be successful. And the debate, I think, needs to include more than just this. You know, we have a mental illness policy problem. We need to have a mental illness policy that we can debate what levels of government ought to be dealing with that. We have to talk about the culture, too. There are a lot of things pulsating through this culture that are coarsening our culture. We ought to talk about those things. We ought to also talk about the reality of just evil in our society. And so if the thing I hope does not happen is we narrow our view and lose sight of the broader problems facing our culture and things that we might want to be able to do, especially with mental illness. And hopefully out of that kind of a civil debate can come actual policies that actually make a real difference in preventing these kinds of things from happening again. But if we narrow this to ideas that in the past have proven not to work, which many people believe infringes upon their constitutional rights, then we will have missed the opportunity to have a better conversation in this country about something that can make a difference.
Do you think the NRA is contributing to a civil debate on this?
I heard about this ad. I haven't seen this ad, but you know, our kids are out of bounds. Look, the Obama campaign, the national media respected that of my family when we ran, and we're grateful for that. Our kids ought to be out of bounds.
Joe?
Three fast ones. Number one, if you raise revenues, they'll just spend it. Or in other words, the blankards can't spend money they don't have. Well, the last 12 years we've proven we can spend money.
That's true. That is true.
So aren't we into eternal vigilance? Number two.
Yeah, but there are no caps. I mean, it's discretionary, but yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
If you have a bill that has real spending cuts in it, and you add $700 billion of revenues, does that mean that the spending cuts aren't real anymore?
Well,
number three.
Okay. I'm not going to get into, no offense, but I just don't think it's in my interest, in our interest, to be negotiating semantics through the media on these things.
Please negotiate in private. Number three, rates matter. Okay, 1986 tax reform got you a 28% top rate by eliminating the preference for dividends and a much smaller preference at the time, a much smaller for dividends, and eliminating the preference for capital gains. If you don't do dividends and capital gains, you are not going to get a top rate at that level. Are dividends and capital gains out of bounds?
Yeah, I've never really, I mean, I think there's a good argument to have between ordinary income and capital income, and how capital income is risk-based income and helps growth. But if your rates are getting low enough, then the difference between the two is not as severe with respect to growth effects. So I think that debate ought to be open with respect to tax reform.
Good for you.
Congressman, is climate change something where you think that there's common ground between Democrats and Republicans?
You know the answer to that, David.
Should it be?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, whether it should be or should not be. It should be guided by sound science. I believe that. And I question the efficacy of these so-called remedies. I question the efficacy of a cap-and-trade program when the biggest so-called emitters, say China and India, won't engage in it. So why is this in our interest to put this burden on our economy and our manufacturers when we know the so-called gains achieved will be wiped out by other countries? Why would we want to do that to ourselves? I believe that technology and scientific research, basic research, not applied research, is something that we could probably get common ground on. Why don't we finance, I've always believed in basic research. I think when you get to the applied, you start getting into the corporate welfare, industrial policy stuff. But why don't we innovate our way out of this instead of trying to tax our way out of this or harm our economy in such a way that it makes carbon-based energy, which is what our economy runs on, so expensive that it paves the way for other unproven technologies. I don't think that's a constructive way forward.
Janet gets the last question.
Congressman, you said at the outset that you were kind of dialing back your expectations now with divided government.
And you talked about trying to get some kind of down payment. I was wondering if you could give us some order of magnitude. And if you don't, let me just say, you know, you put together these things, the Boehner rule, your insistence that you're not going to include any revenues in anything that you do. I'm looking at some pretty small packages, pretty tiny down payments, which sound like a recipe for more governing crisis to crisis.
Well, I don't know if the Boehner rule is a small piece. I mean, if you take these kinds of rules in incremental steps going forward, then that puts you on a pretty good path. If this year we get a good-sized package, and the next year we get a good package, and the year after that, then we're putting ourselves on the path.
I'm just saying that given the it's going to be hard to get an agreement to cut spending for a lot more than what you need for a short-term increase of the debt. I just don't see any end in your strategy to this every 3 months, unless you give something on revenues.
I think well, I wouldn't say that, but I think what Bell mentioned about reforms that have big out-year effects on debt, in my opinion, is the sweet spot in all of this. And so changes that don't offend either party's, I guess, philosophy or ideology. Now, maybe we have disagreement on what that is, but we shouldn't. I think is where hopefully this ends up going, where we put in place these reforms, and we know that these reforms have tremendous out-year effects which stabilize debt and get it going in the right direction and further guarantee that our children aren't going to be saddled with this burden of debt. Those things with big out-year effects, I think have to be balanced in a positive way.
For instance?
I'm not going to get into that. I just don't think it's constructive to get it. I don't think it helps getting an agreement to tell you what it ought to be at the end, because then Democrats dig in against it. And I just don't think that's constructive.
I think we're going to have to end there, but not before saying thanks to you very much for taking the time to do this. Glad to be part of your coming out party. It was our pleasure, and thanks to all of you for coming.